Just to let everyone know that this session is going to be recorded. If you would like to view the session after it's edited, it'll be posted on the UNCG African American and African Diaspora Studies YouTube page, which you are strongly encouraged to follow. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dr. RJ Boutelle, and I am chairing the panel for us today on placemaking and African American life in literature. We've got a great panel of papers for you this afternoon. I'm very pleased to be presenting some of the work of my students and getting to see the evolution of those works. I'm also very excited to learn from those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to learn from yet. So what I'll do is at the beginning, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, and then we will follow the order of presentations on the program. So our first presenter today is Satoria Kraft, who is from Raleigh, North Carolina. She is a political science major with a pre-law concentration and minor in history. They're especially interested in political philosophy and hope to become a civil rights attorney. Our second presenter today is Cece Kallam, who is a sophomore English major from at UNCG, and they're originally from Pittsboro, North Carolina. She's in her third year and is working as an editorial intern with Shannon Media, where she has published writing and photography works. She's also very passionate about bettering the environment and is very involved in the local agricultural scene and works as the newsletter editor and webmaster for the Fearington Farmers Market. Lindsay Shook is a junior English major from Newton, North Carolina, and is also minoring in African American studies. And our final presenter today will be Eliana Brown, who grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is a sophomore in the Lloyd International Honors College, and she's majoring in English and mathematics, going on both ends of the spectrum there, Eliana. She's interested in learning about history and society through literature. It's my pleasure to introduce these panelists and their work for you today. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to our panelists, please feel free to drop those in the chat or in the Q&A. And after we've heard from everyone, I'll be moderating a Q&A session where we'll get to interact with one another. With that, we'll move on to our first presentation. So Satoria, would you like to take it away? Oh, you're muted, Satoria.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's see. All right. So the title of my piece is called "The Soul of the Mulatto Woman." And before I even get into my presentation, I just want to first start off by saying that the term mulatto is a highly derogatory and outdated term. Its meaning derives from the word mule, which is a mix between a donkey and a horse. Mulatto specifically refers to people with one white parent and one Black parent. Although highly offensive, I am choosing to title this piece with the word mulatto because unfortunately, this is how people who were just like me were referred to as for centuries. I think it is important to highlight the historical and derogatory marks that biracial people receive by society. So with that being said, please do not refer to your biracial friends as mulattoes. For a girl like me, understanding my history is still a work in progress that has taken years of education and self-reflection. This is excuse me. This is mainly because mixed race history has been erased from the textbooks. The multiracial population of the United States is about 2.8%. I assume about half are women, and an even smaller portion are women of Black and white ancestry. I am the 1%. The intersectionality of all the facts that make me uncover a dark history, a history that is filled with enslavement, sex trafficking, hypersexualization, fetishization, tragedy, exclusion, identity crisis, privilege, oppression, and the plague of colorism. This is my story. My name is Satoria Craft. I am a political science major and aspiring civil rights attorney. I was born in Clifton Forge, Virginia, which is a small and rural mountain town in the Appalachians. Locals that are familiar with this town refer to it as Mixedville because it is a large amount of biracial people in the town. Poverty and small town life unite the two races, especially in the younger generations. My mother, Victoria, and my father, Joseph, started dating when they were 20 years old. These two caught a case of the teenage fever. They spent their summers tubing in the lake, fishing, hiking, and just having fun. My dad used to play the guitar and serenade my mother outside of our house. They were in love. Unfortunately, my father's side of the family were not happy to see their son with a Black girl. They called her all types of names and made it very clear that she was not to be accepted into their family. Together, the two young adults accidentally created a life. After I was born, my white family members stopped using the N-word, they dropped their racist friends, and they loved their granddaughter. The two young adults had no idea that they had created a girl that would be a part of the 1%. When the realities of having a child set in, the teenage fever between my two parents disappeared and my parents split apart. My mother saw my potential before I could even talk. She spent the first 5 years of my life working and going to school so she could move out of the small town. When I was 6 years old, my mother and I moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, with $1 and a dream that we would become something better than the drugs, sex, and idleness that took place in Clifton Forge. My very first memory of realizing that I was different from the other kids was in 3rd grade, when I started a new school and I noticed that friend groups were largely all of the same sex and race. All of the white kids sat at the same lunch table and played together at recess, same as with the Black kids and the Hispanic kids. I remember feeling confused as to who I would sit with. From as young as my memory extends, I have always been asked, so what are you? Or if people choose to be politically correct, they'll ask what my ethnicity is. Most of the time, people ask me this question before they even ask what my name is. To this day, I have came up with a million different responses to this question. I started 4th grade at a new school. We had moved from Section 8 housing in South Raleigh to a more affluent majority white neighborhood in North Raleigh. These two places were polar opposites. When I reflect back on this moment as an adult, I think the cultural shock of being in a majority white area made me change the way I answered the what are you question. I felt like I could answer that question any way I wanted to, and I wanted to fit in. So I lied and I told people that I was 100% Italian. My cover was blown only when my mother was standing outside my bus stop. I remember my white classmates screaming out the window, asking me why my mom was Black. My mother was so upset with me. She had never really had the race talk with me, and I have to say this conversation was far more awkward than the birds and the bees talk. She asked me if I was ashamed to be Black, and at the time, I think my subconscious was. No one had ever directly taught me anything about race, and I'd certainly never been taught to hate my Blackness. Yet for some reason, I hated the coil of my hair. I hated my ambiguity. I hated picking a side, and I innocently observed that white people were the majority. My inner child wanted acceptance, and when given the option to change who I am to fit in, I took it. Historically, passing as white has played a huge role in mixed race and Black history. Many white passing Black people have walked the color line to bring about change or to expose racism. For example, a white passing mixed woman, Ellen Craft, and her husband, William Craft, dressed Ellen as a white man and William dressed as her servant to travel to the North and escape bondage. During Jim Crow, Homer Plessy, a man who was 7/8 white, passed as white to test the lines of segregation on public trains. Eventually, this case was brought to the Supreme Court, and that is when the holding separate but equal became the rule of the land. Plessy versus Ferguson also legally declares mixed people as Black. In more intermediate forms of passing, mixed people would use their privilege of lighter skin to advocate for Black people in white spaces. My favorite example of this is Adelia Hunt Logan, who is a white-looking mixed woman who advocated for the suffrage and education of Black women. Because of her fair skin, she was invited into NWSA meetings, which was a group of white women, including Susan B. Anthony. She was often the only voice for Black women at these meetings. In a more commonly recognized were mixed people passing as white to enjoy white privilege of economic and social freedom or to avoid violence. Our 21st century view makes it easy to project these people as sellouts, but I think it's important to understand that race was a matter of life or death in the past. If someone was able to pass as white, the risk would be willing to take to avoid inferiority, violence, and lynchings. The mixed people that did choose to pass as white and reinvent themselves likely face identity crisis and a hard life of living in a lie. Passing as white was an old-time American tradition that fair-skinned mixed people used to either escape or walk the color line. For me, this is a short-lived phase that was only a small part of the identity crisis that most mixed people endure. In middle school and high school, I no longer rejected my Blackness, and I was honest about my ethnicity when asked about it. I endured bullying, slurs, and names, which was tough, but I also think that most people go through this during grade school, so I do not consider that to be a form of oppression. However, I continued to live in majority white areas and attended schools in affluent neighborhoods. I certainly assimilated to the majority. I burned my beautiful coils and even fell victim to the creamy crack that is known as hair relaxer. No one ever directly taught me this, but I was subliminally taught to hate my curls and that straight hair was more polished. When I was in middle school, I remember the Trayvon Martin case being of national height. I watched the trial every day after school with my mom. At the time, my brother had just turned 2 years old. My brother is about one shade lighter than Trayvon Martin. I remember feeling so confused and angry that this could have possibly happened to my brother with absolutely no justice. This is when I first became not only aware, but passionate about the law and how it affects Black people. I also remember feeling too young and too powerless to do anything about it. I went to a rich white high school at the time of the Trump era and the Colin Kaepernick era. The racial divide in politics created a social divide in my school, followed by several racial incidents at my school. At this time, I was old enough to form my own opinions. I became increasingly interested in the law and politics, and I was fiercely passionate about protecting my baby brother from the evils of racism. I became more in tune and proud of my Blackness. However, as I became more in tune with my Blackness, I also became more confused about my whiteness. My interest in politics in high school is the main reason I chose to major in political science in college. When I came to college, I felt like I'd entered my Enlightenment era. I stopped straightening my hair. I went from being treated like a minority to feeling accepted in every space that I entered. I learned the accurate story of American history, systems of privilege and oppression, and my turning point in college was taking American political thought when I read the philosophy of all the great thinkers throughout American history. This is when I really started to study mixed race history and all of the problems that come with our stance in society. When studying the mixed race, the first issue that I was confronted with was colorism. Colorism is a discrimination against individuals with darker skin tones within a racial group. There is a common misconception that colorism only occurs within the Black community, but colorism is actually a global phenomenon that occurs in almost every racial group in every continent. The origins of colorism in the Black community is a complicated story filled with multiple changes as ideas about race change and vary throughout regions. But even through every attempt to collapse social stratification, colorism and privilege remains for light-skinned Black people. During the plantation generation of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley, light-skinned mixed people were of the most privileged within the Black community. So much so that referring to mixed people as Black would be considered offensive. They owned land, they were prominent figures in their community, and some even owned slaves themselves. During the same time period, mixed enslaved people in the Upper South were stuck in slavery and considered Black under the law of maternal descent, which held that the legal status of the enslaved mother would carry on to their offspring. Despite these facts, mixed people were the majority of enslaved people to be manumitted. In 1860 in the Deep South, over 75% of free Blacks were mixed and only 9% of enslaved people were mixed. It was so common for mixed people to be manumitted that the terms mulatto and free Blacks were used interchangeably. During the antebellum period of slavery, the mulatto classification became less favorable as white Southerners strived to harden racial lines and associate slavery with Black and free with white. During Reconstruction, mixed people were the target of racial recalibration. The ideology of the one-drop rule emerged as the rise of eugenics validated the inferior treatment and segregation of Black people. If mixed people chose not to pass as white, they would fall into the category of colored. There is also this common misconception that colorism emerged because of this great divide between house and field slaves. It is believed that lighter-skinned people were given domestic tasks, while darker people were given outside tasks that were much harder. Although this likely did occur, sometimes blaming colorism on the divide between the house and the field oversimplifies a more complicated story. We have to break our wronged understanding of the house and the field in order to really understand colorism and how the Black community relates with one another. First, domestic servants were not always light-skinned, and not all field workers were dark. Slavery was an economic system, and most enslaved people worked in the fields because field hands were more profitable. Only about 2 to 10% of enslaved people were domestic servants. Men, women, and children of all colors worked in the field. Both domestic and field workers desired to switch places. Field work was hard, grueling work that came with frequent beatings, poor living conditions, and long hours, while domestic servants, mostly women, were raped daily, treated awfully by the wives of their slave masters, and constantly reminded of their inferior status. Oftentimes, we think of house slaves as being overly loyal and submissive, but this stereotype is proven incorrect when the Civil War began and there was a mass exodus of enslaved people. Domestic servants ran too. They did not stick around with their masters like they were expected to. In every form, slavery was a great evil, and if people did submit or show loyalty to their abusers, it was certainly a coping mechanism to avoid death and violence. We have to get an accurate story of slavery in order to understand how colorism works. In several Black elitist institutions, such as college fraternities, sororities, and some churches, Black people would compare one skin tone to a brown paper bag. If their skin was darker than a brown paper bag, they would not be admitted into the institution. This phenomenon is known as the brown paper bag test. This toxic legacy of colorism has constantly given off the message that lighter skin and proximity to whiteness is better. Despite all the setbacks and attempts to reduce skin color stratification, mixed people remained privileged in several ways. Colorism is systemic. It takes place in criminal justice, employment, health, education. Colorism is reinforced and exemplified through beauty standards, fashion, media, music, and everyday social relations. Throughout all times of history, including today, light skin or mixed people were far more wealthy than their darker counterparts. Their businesses were more likely to be prosperous. They were often given better jobs. They are more likely to live longer, less likely to have mental health issues, better physical health, higher wages, more education, lower conviction rates, shorter prison sentences, and are even disciplined less and more mildly in school. These are the more hidden benefits of colorism. The more obvious advantages of colorism are found in the media. In Black media, light-skinned men and women are the beauty standard. Stereotypes of light-skinned and dark-skinned people are portrayed in TV shows and movies. My favorite example of this is the TV show Martin. In the show Martin, Gina, the light-skinned woman, is shown as loving and gentle, deserving of romance, feminine and beautiful, while Pam, her dark-skinned friend, was portrayed as angry and aggressive and more masculine. While Pam, her dark-skinned friend, was portrayed as angry and aggressive, these stereotypes are portrayed in so many different movies and shows that it has flooded the consciousness of Black America and changed the way we view each other. Colorism is a system of discrimination and privilege in which lighter-skinned people will always be the beneficiaries of. When studying my identity, one of the hardest parts was to accept is that I am privileged because of my skin color. I am truthfully ashamed of my privilege, but I think it is important to acknowledge privilege and to have these uncomfortable conversations to bring awareness to the issue. Although as a light-skinned, mixed and ambiguous woman, I will never be oppressed by the system of colorism. That does not mean that I do not feel the effects that the divide that colorism has created within the Black community. Light-skinned people will not suffer from colorism, but instead will face their own unique set of issues. All right, so one of the first mixed race issues that I wanted to address is racial fetishization by both the Black and the white communities. Fetishization is a sexual fascination with things that are not inherently sexual, like race, gender, sexuality, or body type. Fetishization reduces people to a certain characteristic and can be extremely dehumanizing. Countless numbers of white women have told me that they can't wait to have pretty little mixed babies just like me. Countless number of Black men and white men have told me that they are only attracted to light skin or white women. A lot of people may be familiar with the Facebook and Instagram pages that glorify mixed babies. People have described me, as well as other mixed people, as exotic, or terms that are edible, such as honey and caramel. Telling a mixed person that you want your kids to be mixed or that you are only attracted to someone because of their skin tone is not a compliment. It is a fetish that is motivated by implicit biases. Being racially fetishized takes away my humanity and my personality, and it replaces it with basing my attractiveness off of things that I cannot control, such as my skin color or my hair texture. Mixed people, especially women, experience fetishization by both the Black and white community, yet we are also rejected by both the Black and white community, which brings me to the next issue of exclusion, rejection, and loneliness. A common denominator for most mixed people is the feeling of having to pick a side. I was always too white for the Black kids and too Black for the white kids. I remember people always asking me, which part of my race do I identify the most with? So many mixed people were bullied as children by both Black and white people simply for their race. Bullying and exclusion is something that I suffered from as a child. Because of this exclusion at such an early age, my social skills are quite horrible and I have become used to being alone. That loneliness has become the norm for me. Society has told me that I'm good enough to be fetishized and hypersexualized, but I'm not good enough to be fully recognized as a member of each racial group that I personally identify with. And the next issue is the different meanings of Blackness. Another question that most biracial people are faced with is, what does it mean to be Black? Is it the coil of my hair, the color of my skin, my ancestry, my legal and political status? What does it mean to be Black? Certainly, race and Blackness is all socially constructed, and there really is no clear definition as to what it is because race is never biological. Eugenics suggests that there is a one-drop rule and that one drop of Black blood is enough to be considered fully Black. The coil of my hair is usually the clear giveaway that I am mixed, which is why I've learned to fall in love with my curls. And if looking solely at the color of my skin, then I guess I would be considered white. And politically and legally, the mixed race has been declared as Black. For some reason, society has completely rejected the idea that it is possible for both whiteness and Blackness to coexist in one body. Oftentimes, the Black community socially only accepts mixed people who fully embrace their Blackness, or if their Blackness can be used to show the success of the Black community. For example, President Barack Obama is coined as the first Black president, but Obama was raised by a white woman. Obama was the first biracial president. After hearing that this mixed man was given the title of first Black president, I thought for sure that the Black community would finally accept me as fully Black, but that still has never happened. The Black community picks and chooses the mixed people that it wants to accept, with the more ambiguous mixed people being completely shut out of both Black and white communities. The last part of my identity that I had to confront is womanhood. Specifically mixed womanhood, which has its own unique characteristics. During antebellum slavery days, white women were stereotyped as models of self-respect and sexual purity, while Black women, and in particular mixed Black women, were stereotyped as the Jezebel and the tragic mulatto. All of these stereotypes were seen in literature and cinema and portrays mixed women being characterized by self-hatred, depression, alcoholism, sexual perversion, and suicide attempts being the most common. The Jezebel stereotype portrays Black and mixed women as sexually seductive and predatory, while also being the opposite of the Mammy character, which desexualizes Black women. Each of these stereotypes against Black and mixed women were used to justify rapes between the slave and the slaver. There was also a fancy girl trade that took place in the antebellum period of slavery. The fancy girl trade was the trade and sale of light-skinned mixed women into sexual slavery of prostitution and concubinage. In 1786, Louisiana passed the Tignon Law that forced Black women to cover their hair in scarves. This law emerged to control women who had become too light-skinned or who dressed too elegantly or competed too freely with white women for status and thus threatened the social order. Today, mixed women can wear their hair freely and do not have to worry about being a sex slave. Mixed women today are privileged in many ways, but still fall victim to misogyny, hypersexualization, and toxic stereotypes in different ways. Black music has mastered this hypersexualization by coining the terms yellow bone and red bone, which refers to light-skinned women of different hues and are often only used when sexualizing and fetishizing light-skinned women. As with any fetish, these terms are dehumanizing. It also teaches young Black girls that they are not sexually desirable unless they are light-skinned, and young mixed girls that they are only worthy because of their bodies. When race, color, and gender meet at intersecting lines, it is found that mixed women are constantly victim to stereotypes from the past. There is a privileged status that comes with proximity to whiteness, while also an oppressive and dehumanizing status that comes with being a Black woman. When I think back to the first time in school, when I struggled between sitting with the white or the Black kids, to passing as white in grade school, to discovering and embracing my Blackness, and all the way to the Enlightenment era that I am in now, I think of how all these life experiences of mine were caused by things that I have no control over, which is my race, color, and gender. I write this piece knowing that alone I cannot cure all the privileges and oppressions that I'm subject to, but instead I hope the Black, white, and mixed communities can embrace these uncomfortable conversations, become more aware of their implicit biases, and unite on the count of all being a part of the human race. Thank you for listening to my story.
Great, thank you, Satoria, for sharing such a personal and thought-provoking narrative to get us started. I believe our next presenter is Cece Kallam.
Okay, that is tough to follow. That was really good. So mine is an essay. I won't be sharing a PowerPoint or anything. I'll just be reading. So I would like to begin my segment of this discussion by reading the poem I analyzed in my essay, On Being Brought from Africa to America by Phyllis Wheatley. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So many of you may be familiar with Phyllis Wheatley. She was the first published African-American poet. She was born in 1753, kidnapped from West Africa at the age of 7, sold into slavery, and enslaved by John and Susanna Wheatley. Keep in mind that rather than recognizing Phyllis for her talents, the Wheatleys often used her as a form of entertainment and would invite guests over to show her ability to read and write. Phyllis's unique situation as an educated, talented, yet enslaved young Black woman has been discussed and analyzed for years. No one knows how she truly felt or what her experience was really like outside of her writings. Okay, so now I will get into the essay. All right. Okay, so Symbols and Significance by Phyllis Wheatley on being brought from Africa to America. Being captured and enslaved from the early age of 7, Phyllis Wheatley grew up in a Western society and in Christianity. She eventually became baptized and identified as a Christian. She was able to use her knowledge of the religion and to her advantage in her poetry. In her poem on being brought from Africa to America, she was able to convey the real motives of her enslavers and question their Christian ways. Wheatley uses literary devices to establish her position as the writer and speaker. She italicized specific words to draw her point to religion and uses various punctuation to change whom her poem is directing and how she approaches her audience. She writes in a sarcastic way that makes the reader question the genuineness of the poem and possible underlying messages. Together, the message in the poem and how it is said creates a deeper and more complex meaning. Much of what is said in the text has more than one meaning and can be interpreted in more than one way depending on the reader, and even more specifically in the context of the time it was published and depending on the race and social status of the reader. Within the poem, there are religious references highlighted to engage the intended audience and to create a higher contrast between the audience and Phyllis Wheatley, bringing into question the entire system of slavery itself. Remember Christians, Negroes, Black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. These last 2 lines in the poem are significant because Wheatley puts the words Christians and Negroes right next to each other, signifying that they are 2 separate things. To the intended audience, who are typically white, they are not one and the same. But Wheatley is writing from both an African American and a Christian perspective. She is alluding to the idea that you do not have to be a white American to also be Christian or to be saved by God. She is saying that anyone can be saved. It is hard to identify in the text where she is being genuine. She praises her enslavers and captors in a way that feeds their ego, but there is no way to be sure whether her intentions were genuine or her feelings towards them were true. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. This line in the middle of the poem signifies the drastic change in tone. From this point on in the text, the speaker directly speaks about African Americans and how they are viewed. By comparing African Americans to Cain, Wheatley is supporting the idea that anyone, no matter who or how bad they might be, can be saved and changed for the better. Another symbol relating to the text is the author's name. Although this is not mentioned in the text, it is still important to note because it is relevant to the message. Her first name, Phyllis, was chosen because it was the name of the ship she was put on after being kidnapped from her original home in West Africa. And like many enslaved people in America, she was given her enslaver's last name, Wheatley. She resided in the home of Susanna and John Wheatley. Although she was not treated equally, being that she was enslaved, she was given an education which provided her with liminal space and a sense of creative freedom. She used poetry to express herself and make a difference. White Americans, like John and Susanna Wheatley, viewed their colonization as saving people from their pagan lands. Wheatley's enslaver's self-righteous way of life allowed her to gain an education to contradict how her audience might view her and other African Americans. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Cece. Our next presenter is Lindsay Shook.
Hi. Okay, I am going to be reading a paper about the novel Iola Leroy and its connection to the idea of the racial uplift. So the novel Iola Leroy is a tale of formerly enslaved peoples and their lives and relationships with others and the world around them during and after the Civil War. The main character is a mixed race woman who is born into a free family but is kidnapped into slavery and subsequently rescued. While the physical war may end, the ideas of slavery and racism still persist in the world, and the characters of the novel must navigate and decide for themselves what to do in these situations. One of these situations is the idea that all formerly enslaved people must educate themselves, learn to read and write and do things that white people would consider the right thing to do in terms of education. This idea of the racial uplift, with other Black people having a certain obligation to raise up others in education and teach them to be as educated as they are in order to fit well into a society that is formatted predominantly for white people, is one that Iola Leroy does not seem to consider as something they should feel obligated to do. Iola Leroy is not invested in the idea of the racial uplift. While Iola and Robert, two characters in the novel, are educated and see the benefits they have in the world with said education, they not force the idea of learning or fitting into society in the education aspects onto others who do not wish to learn. The novel does not force the idea of racial uplift. With Iola and Robert being educated Black people who do not try to change other formerly enslaved people to get an education like they have, but rather appreciate and see the value in them, such as characters like Tom Anderson, Uncle Daniel, and Aunt Linda. They're characters who are proven to be good and important to the lives and the story, despite not being educated. When Robert goes to fight for the Union in the Civil War, some of his friends and loved ones join as well. One of those people being Tom Anderson, someone who seems to be not as educated as Robert in the traditional sense, seen in the way his words are written in the novel, and that Tom is only allowed to be a servant for the Union, working to help Union soldiers and officers get things that they need or want, not someone who fights or is given the opportunity to rise in the ranks. When Robert, someone with lighter skin and a more intellectual way of speaking, is given the chance to join the white ranks, he refuses. Quote, "Now there is Tom Anderson," said Robert. "He is just as Black can be. He has been bought and sold like a beast, and there is not a braver man in all the company." Robert's refusal to join the white ranks of the Union and have the opportunity to climb higher in the ranks and make more money comes from his bond with the people he was enslaved with. Tom may not be as smart as Robert is in the typical white society ideas of education and intellect, but his bravery and kindness gain Robert's affection and his continual stay in a Black section of the Union Army. Robert cares for Tom, and that helps him make his choice, but he also sees Tom's value as a human being. Quote, "He is a noble-hearted fellow, true as steel. I love him like a brother." His intelligence in reading or writing is not a factor in how Robert sees him. Rather, his kindness and continual care and honesty with the folks around him proves to Robert what kind of man Tom is. And that is more important to Robert than if he has intelligence that a white person would consider more valuable. The racial uplift idea is not important to Robert when it comes to Tom, and he would rather stay in the same unit as Tom than leave to join a white unit that may have more intellect. Robert does not feel the need to teach Tom how to read or write or fit in better into a white ideal, but instead sees that Tom is valuable and important in his own ways in the Union Army and in the Black community, regardless of education level. Robert in these moments shows how Black unity in the face of adversity in these situations was more important to him than the idea that white intelligence was something everyone needed in order to be valued or considered to be included in society. Tom is also seen to have no need for intelligence in the reading and writing sense when it comes to his interactions with Iola Leroy, who nonetheless enjoys his company and values him as a person. Iola Leroy meets Tom Anderson when he is injured on the battlefield, but he was instrumental in her escape from her most recent enslaver. Tom hears of her predicament and speaks to anyone he can about helping her escape to the Union Army. Quote, "Tom was very anxious to get word to the beautiful but intractable girl who was held in durance vile by her reckless and selfish master." These scenes of Tom showing his caring and courageous traits show the readers that the value of a Black person cannot be placed on their education solely, and that the author, as well as the characters in the story, do not value it as highly as white society does. His heart and kindness eventually help lead to the rescue of Iola, with no need for him to change or become smarter in order for this to be done. His continual checking in on Iola and speaking to anyone he can about getting her help is enough for the characters and the readers to see Tom's true nature and value. When Tom gets injured in battle, Iola cares for him. And this scene again shows that there is no need for the idea of racial uplift to be used in this novel because they care for their friends who may seem less educated, just the same as anyone who was educated. Quote, "Oh, Mr. Tom," said Iola tenderly, "do not talk of leaving me. You are the best friend I have had since I was torn from my mother." Iola's friendship with Tom does not come with any conditions and instead is full of the same kindness which Tom is known to give. Iola never mentions Tom's manner of speaking or his lack of reading ability, and instead sees him as a friend and one that does not need to change, as she loves him as he is. Even as he is lying on his deathbed, Iola continues to prove that they are the closest of friends, despite the gap in education that some would believe is an important difference between them. Quote, "Tenderly she wiped the death damps from his dusky brow and imprinted upon it a farewell kiss." A kiss is an extremely intimate gesture, one that shows an extreme affection for another person. This action even being seen as outlandish by other characters in the novel. By doing this for Tom, Iola is showing they are equals, despite any perceived differences that others may think need to be changed. Iola shows that Tom is her equal no matter what, never needing for him to become educated as she is for him to be someone she trusts and loves. She also shows this later in the novel when she meets Aunt Linda, a woman who does not know how to read or write, yet despite this is still someone Iola looks up to as a motherly and wise figure, whom she respects as an equal. When Robert and Iola travel back to Robert's former place of enslavement after the Civil War, they meet Aunt Linda, whom Iola takes a liking to and sees as a sort of motherly figure that she has not had in her life for some time. While Aunt Linda is not educated in the traditional sense and knows only more practical education, such as farming or cooking, this does not seem to matter to Iola. Even as Iola is just listening to Aunt Linda speak, she grows to care for her. Quote, "Over Iola stole a spirit of restfulness. There was something so motherly in Aunt Linda's manner that it seemed to recall the bright, sunshiny days." She recognizes Aunt Linda as someone motherly, and this causes her to feel safe and secure around her, something that may be more important to someone who is formerly enslaved and has seen the horrors of war than a trait like education. Aunt Linda creates a comforting aura for Iola to relax in, and her company may be more valuable because it reminds Iola of her mother, who she is on a journey to look for after the Civil War ends. This parallel between her own mother may give even more reason for Iola to feel no need for Aunt Linda to become educated. Iola also recognizes the type of education that Aunt Linda does possess, the worldly education that someone who has lived a long life would have and can give advice about. Quote, "That's just the way. You see that, Miss Iola? One man taken up for the other. But I'll be even with you both. I must go now and get ready." Iola laughed. The homely enjoyment of that evening was very welcome. Aunt Linda has worldly advice she can give to Iola, which Iola listens to and does not contradict or try to talk over. They have a conversation of mutual respect, one that does not involve Iola correcting or trying to educate Aunt Linda in the proper way to speak or on any other educational topic. Iola simply has a regular conversation with Aunt Linda that one would have with a friend, with no ulterior motives to change the way Aunt Linda behaves or speaks. This does not mean that Iola follows what Aunt Linda says blindly, but that she respects her and her opinions. Evident again when she has a conversation with Aunt Linda where they seem to disagree, but do not argue. Quote, "But Aunt Linda," pursued Iola, "if it were shabby for an ignorant colored man to sell his vote, wasn't it even shabbier for an intelligent white man to buy it?" Then Aunt Linda responds, quote, "I know that," said Aunt Linda, "but I can't help it. I want my people to vote right and to think something of themselves." While they seem to disagree at first, they listen to each other respectfully, and it turns out that they have similar views on the subject, just expressed differently. Iola does not talk over Aunt Linda or try to force her to see it from her perspective, but instead gives her the same respect Aunt Linda has given her when she speaks on her own side of the discussion. Where this could have been an opportunity for Iola to educate Aunt Linda and force Aunt Linda to listen to her side and prove that she was right, she listens to what Aunt Linda says and tries to see her perspective. Iola understands that while Aunt Linda may have a different perspective and is not educated in the way Iola is, she still gives Aunt Linda respect and time to share her own ideas and opinions, having a natural conversation with her rather than trying to change her ideas or force her to listen to Iola's own. Iola has no motive for racial uplift and understands that Aunt Linda has different forms of knowledge and wisdom that may be useful for Iola to learn from her, rather than it being the other way around, with Iola teaching Aunt Linda ways to better fit into a white society's standards. Robert seems to also share a similar feeling about education when it comes to Aunt Linda, as well as Uncle Daniel, her husband. When Robert meets Uncle Daniel again after the war, they meet cordially, trying to feel out how the other is going to respond in this situation. But Robert shows his feelings for Uncle Daniel as they continue to speak. Quote, "Well, Mr. Robert." "Oh, no, no, Uncle Daniel," interrupted Robert. "Don't say that. Call me Robbie or Bob, too." Robert does not want to seem better or higher than Uncle Daniel because of his service in the war or his education. He wants to be seen as his equal. Superiority does not come from education to Robert, and he wants Uncle Daniel to know that they are still the same as they were before, equals. With Uncle Daniel even being placed higher in Robert's mind based on age, wisdom, and respect, and Linda, but in a way that is different from his interaction with Uncle Daniel. Robert and Linda are having a conversation about getting an education, where the reader can feel about the subject and how they feel about each other, even with opposing viewpoints. Quote, "I suppose by this time you know how to read and write?" "No, child. Since freedom come, I've been scratching too hard to get a living to put my head down to the book." "But Aunt Linda, when your husband is away, to take a book. Do you ever get lonesome?" "Child, I ain't got no time to get lonesome." While Robert does pose the idea of getting educated and learning to read to Aunt Linda, he does so not because he thinks she must be educated. He simply wants her to have something she can do to pass the time in a way Robert finds to be a bit more enjoyable than simply doing the usual chores of cooking and cleaning. To further prove his intentions are not just because he believes he should educate her, when she says she does not want to learn to read, he does not push the subject further and lets her decide what she wants to do. He lets it be her decision whether or not she wishes to be educated in reading and writing, and does not force her to feel like she has to be educated to be a good or better person. Aunt Linda tells Robert that she is too busy to learn to read and that she does not see the need for it when she has so much to do around the house and the farmland they have. And Robert does not push the question any further. Robert respects her opinion on the subject and will not force her to do something she does not want to do, even if he does see it as something enjoyable and useful. This respect he has for her is higher than his ideas on reading or education. People are more important to Robert and Iola than the idea that they all must be educated to fit into society. Neither Iola nor Robert push education onto any of their friends or relatives who are not already educated. And even when suggesting, the idea is simply that, a suggestion, and not something they believe must be done in order for someone to be respected on the same level as they already are. Their respect for others as people and human beings who can make their own choices, who are inherently important, is an idea more valuable to them than the idea that they all need to be educated to live a better life. The community they have in one another has shown them the value in others, despite their differences that may be seen as deficient to a white community who only sees value in someone who can educate or is educated enough to work in a white society. To reiterate a point from before, people are more important to them than the standards of white society is. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsay. Our final presenter on this panel this afternoon will be Eliana Brown.
Okay. My paper is talking about the function of place in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Beloved is a novel about the trauma of slavery, even after the end of slavery as an institution. The characters in Beloved are multifaceted and have rightfully been analyzed intensely over the course of decades, but the spaces in which they operate are also complex and worthy of discussion. While Denver and Sethe are complex characters, the spaces that they inhabit are written to be dynamic and somewhat anthropomorphic. On the very first page of the book, 124 is described as spiteful and full of baby's venom. However, 124 was not always like that. Once, it was a place where the Black community in Cincinnati came together. Over the course of the novel, 124 and Sweet Home change alongside the characters, reflecting and embodying their trauma and lives. Beloved is a novel that uses descriptions of Sweet Home and 124 to present space as dynamic and intertwined with its inhabitants. Before Sethe came to 124, she was enslaved at Sweet Home, a paradoxically named plantation that represented the violence of enslavement. Mr. Garner, the first overseer, viewed enslaved people as men and not boys, Morrison 13. Despite Mr. Garner's implication that he viewed the enslaved men on his plantation as actual men, he was still an enslaver. Mr. and Mrs. Garner may have liked to think of themselves as gentler than most, but they did not act like they thought their enslaved people were human. Sethe is literally referred to as a timely present after baby Suggs left the plantation. Sethe was brought to Sweet Home when she was 13 and allowed to pick herself a husband. While Mr. and Mrs. Garner may have thought this as some sort of act of charity because they were not directly forcing her to marry a specific person, they put a child into a position in which she had to choose a husband. The enslaved men of Sweet Home let her choose, but they had to hold themselves off by assaulting cattle. Mr. Garner's assertion that he treated his enslaved workers better than other enslavers was merely a veneer. He may have treated his enslaved workers marginally better than others in a way that discouraged them from trying to self-liberate, but he still allowed his men to be put in a position where they were forced to bestiality in order to allow Sethe a choice of husband while she was a child. While Sweet Home under Mr. Garner was a space that allowed Sethe some choice, school teachers' honest brutality let enslaved people of Sweet Home reconceptualize it as a place rooted in violence. Sweet Home under school teacher is a place in which two white boys feel that they have the right to hold Sethe down and drink her breast milk. Sweet Home under school teacher was a place so horrible that Sethe killed her own child rather than let her go back to there to grow up as an enslaved person. While Sweet Home under Mr. Garner was a place that allowed Sethe a choice of husband, Sweet Home under school teacher was a place where Sethe could be sexually assaulted without repercussions for the assaulters. Sethe did not have plans to escape Sweet Home under Mr. Garner, but under school teacher, she would rather die than return. Sweet Home exists in two distinct ways. Under Mr. Garner, the more lenient enslaver, and under school teacher, the more honestly brutal enslaver. As Nancy Jesser suggests in Violence, Home, and Community, Garner speaks the same language as school teacher. The language of enslavement is fundamentally linked to the trauma that Sweet Home represents. At Sweet Home, it did not matter that Mr. Garner claimed to view the enslaved people as people, because being enslaved is intrinsically dehumanizing. The reality of being seen as property had made Sweet Home into a place in which Sethe felt that she could not truly love her children. As Jesser suggests, she was allowed to love her children because the Garners let her raise them, and not because they were hers. All of this makes Sweet Home, whether under Mr. Garner or school teacher, a place that represents the trauma of enslavement for Sethe and PoliSci. Throughout the novel, there are flashbacks to Sweet Home. Sweet Home, the place, is not merely a backdrop. It is also the structures that allowed and encouraged the violence. Sweet Home is not just representative of where enslaved people were subjugated, but also of the trauma that came from people being dehumanized, commercialized, and manipulated. While Sweet Home is representative of the trauma that Sethe and other enslaved people experienced there, 124 is a place that is first shaped by being a representation of the freedom and then by Sethe's act of infanticide. At the beginning of the novel, 124 is introduced as full of baby's venom. However, 124 is first a place of refuge. 20 days after Sethe frees herself and her children from enslavement, the Black community of Cincinnati comes together in the kitchen of 124 to celebrate their freedom. At this moment, the house is shaped by community. 124 continues to be a place of refuge for Sethe until school teacher comes to take Sethe and her children back to Sweet Home. At that point, she decides that death would be better than enslavement and kills Beloved, her unnamed child. After she is released from jail for murdering her baby, 124 is haunted. The house is haunted because of what Sethe did, but she does not fully understand that. Sethe does not want to remember what happened. She is ashamed because of it and is cut off from the rest of the community. When PoliSci comes back, Sethe admits that the house is haunted, but does not tell him that she has killed her baby. Sethe is willing to admit that the house is haunted, but unwilling to process what she did to Beloved. Like Sethe, the house is suspended in time. The house and the family are cut off from the community because of Sethe's act of infanticide and refusal to acknowledge what happened. Even though 124 is introduced as spiteful, it is all that Denver knows, and to her, it is a space in which she grew up with the ghost of her sister. Denver was kept company by the ghost of her little sister, The ghost was what 124 meant to Denver. Quote, Denver approached the house, regarding it, as she always did, as a person rather than a structure. To Denver, 124 is not just a haunted house. It is all she has ever known, and after baby Suggs died and her brothers ran away, she was isolated with only Sethe and 124. To Denver, 124 is a living and breathing embodiment of the sister that she never got to have. After she is told that Sethe is the one who killed Beloved, she cannot have an uncomplicated love for her mother because she knows that Sethe was going to kill her too. Because of this, 124 and then Beloved are the only things that Denver is able to love in an uncomplicated way. All of this has shaped who Denver is as a person. At the beginning of the novel, she is around 18 years old, but she is referred to as a child by Paul D. when he first comes to 124. Denver has been emotionally stunted because of her trauma. Her isolation in the house with Sethe, who refuses to acknowledge and move on from what happened, has made her into a girl who cannot relate to people emotionally. She is so emotionally and socially isolated that when Beloved comes, Denver, who recognizes her as her dead sister faster than Sethe does, becomes obsessed with her. 124 is a place that is transformed by Sethe's maternal act of violence that isolates the people living there. However, Sethe is unable to face and accept the haunting is directly related to her. Although Sethe and Denver live in the same house, they have different perceptions of 124 and the source of their problems. When Paul D first comes to 124, he is told that the house is haunted. Denver tells him that no one ever talks to them. Then Sethe and Denver argue, quote, it's the house. People don't, it's not the house. It's us and it's you. This exchange presents a key difference in how Sethe and Denver experience the house. As Andrew Ng notes, Sethe, unlike Denver, fails to recognize the haunting as directly related to her. She acknowledges that it is the baby who is haunting the house, but does not place the blame on herself like Denver does. Denver, whose life has been marked by Beloved's death, is able to recognize the haunting because of how Beloved died. Although Sethe cannot recognize that the haunting is related to her, the house, and then later Beloved, is deeply attached to Sethe. After Paul D suggests that they move, the house itself braced, and the quiet that came after the question was listening. That 124 had a physical reaction to the suggestion that Sethe should move, suggests that the haunting is linked not to the physical place where Beloved died, but rather to the mother who felt she had no choice but to kill her. After Paul D exercises the house at the beginning, the spite of the house is gone, but Paul D was moving it to someplace else, then standing in the place he had made. Soon after this scene, Beloved comes out of the water to stay at 124 with Sethe. Beloved's appearance after the spirit was driven away suggests that the spirit is drawn to wherever Sethe is. While Beloved is deeply attached to Sethe and to 124, she cannot understand Sethe or why she did what she did, so she demands everything Sethe could possibly give to her. Beloved states that this is the place that I am. If we are to take Beloved's assertion that she is 124 seriously, then we must consider 124 as Denver does, as a person rather than a structure. However, Andrew Ng suggests that this could be a result of poor grammar and merely a way of stating that 124 is her home. In either case, Beloved is deeply identifying herself with 124. In addition to identifying herself with 124, Beloved's actions through the novel work to isolate the family even further from the community. After Paul D leaves 124, Sethe loses her job and the food begins to run low. Beloved takes Sethe's portions, which causes Sethe to begin to waste away. Beloved cannot understand what Sethe did, but she needs her mother's unconditional love. Despite receiving Sethe's food and her attempts at some sort of reconciliation, Beloved cannot and will never understand the terrible choice that Sethe was forced to make. This inability to reconcile and to understand means that Beloved will not stop until Sethe is dead from giving her life in the form of her food. It is only once Denver ventures into the community and outside of the house that any progress can be made. She knows that Beloved is draining Sethe's life force, but on her own, she is powerless to stop it. In a way, so long as the inhabitants of 124 remain in the house, they are not only isolated, but also suspended in time. Beloved, as a reincarnation of Sethe's daughter, is forcing Sethe to live in a moment where her child is still alive. Sethe wants to believe that Beloved already understands and that she will not have to explain. When Beloved does not understand, Sethe begins giving her her own food. Beloved wants all of Sethe, but Beloved cannot understand why Sethe did what she did. Because of this, Beloved's presence will never let her reach any sort of closure. In the end, Paul D was wrong about leaving 124. Leaving 124 would never have stopped the haunting. Sethe would still be traumatized, and Denver would not have the impetus to grow. Sethe and Denver do not move at the end of the novel because the house was not a standalone haunted structure. It was haunted because the woman inside it refused to face her trauma and held on to a ghost instead of living alongside her daughter. Moving would not have helped because Denver was right. The problem was never the house, it was the people living in it. Place and Beloved is not merely a backdrop for the characters and their interactions. Rather, it is an interactive space that represents the mental states of the characters within the novel. For instance, Sweet Home is referenced not merely as a plantation. It had a hold on the people who were forced to live there because it was representative of the violence that they were continually subjected to. Because of this, characters in the novel continually reference Sweet Home decades after they have freed themselves. Similarly, 124 is not merely a house that Sethe and Denver live in, but a space in which repressed memories live and in which the traumatized characters are suspended in time and isolated from their communities until they gather the courage to leave.
All right, thank you so much, Eliana. Well, let's give a hand to all of our panelists who presented some very exciting papers for us. Unfortunately, Satoria had to step out, but I would now like to invite our audience to jump in with questions. If you have questions or comments for our panelists, you can drop those in the Q&A or in the chat. And maybe while we're waiting for some folks to get their comments and questions together, I'll maybe take a moment and do a little facilitating here. I think Satoria's paper at the open of this panel gave us all a lot of language and history and experience to sort of build off of, and I think it did some really strong framing for the rest of these papers. In particular, a lot of thinking about these ideas of in-betweenness that a lot of you are dealing with in your papers in really different ways. Cece, in your paper, thinking about Phyllis Wheatley as somebody who, although she is not biracial herself, is very much kind of caught between the West African world of her childhood and the very white world that she ends up living in Boston and London, and sort of feeling that two-ness, right? What W.E.B. Du Bois calls that double consciousness, right? Of sort of being caught between two worlds, feeling the pressures of those two different worlds in different ways. Lindsay, you addressed this also in your paper, thinking about Iola Leroy and not only sort of being caught in this sort of transitional moment between slavery and freedom following the Civil War and sort of on the cusp of Reconstruction, but also thinking about the different kinds of pressures and experiences within the Black community that are shaped by not only things like racial ancestry and skin color, but also age and generation and experience and class, right? And how all those different things can texture different parts of the Black experience. And Eliana, in your paper, thinking about being caught in between past and present, in between slavery and freedom, but also in between places, and what kind of the psychological experiences of being caught in between places are when the places themselves are kind of ever changing and ever shifting, that when the places themselves are kind of not static and constantly evolving. So I just kind of wanted to draw out some of those connections and resonances across the papers. I'll invite the panelists to kind of talk amongst yourselves or to respond to any of my provocations as you might. So if anyone wants to jump in, yeah, please feel free to do so. Eliana, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to point out the similarities because they are all very different papers. And I really like the idea of like suspended in between time. I think that's a really important aspect of it. And it's a really important aspect of like people's responses to this like very traumatic life that they had. And I think that's kind of what my paper is trying to get at. Like they left, they freed themselves, but they couldn't free themselves from the memories entirely. And even towards the end of Beloved, the ending is kind of ambiguous. Like, do they ever really forget her? Do they disremember? I thought it was really interesting.
For me, I think that like one conversation, especially in my current English classes, where kind of like it's discussing like why are we still talking about these works today, and it's like these conversations keep coming up because they're still like prevalent in our society today. And even though like with Phyllis Wheatley, her poems were written so long ago, but it's still such a mystery to us. And especially talking about how she not only was educated, but at the time she was also enslaved, and trying to understand how she might have felt about that. And then now how that kind of affects people today, especially people of color, trying to navigate between what it is to be an educated, like young African-American person, and also having that history of oppression. So I think it's definitely interesting to talk about and think about. I think for me, I always just, it makes me feel really like sad when I think about how a lot of what writers, especially like Phyllis Wheatley, were going through and what they experienced, a lot of that wasn't written down because that wasn't safe for them to do. So we really have no idea the extent of what they actually experienced.
I think to sort of go off what you were saying, Cece, about how we need to read this material and it's still prevalent and needed, I think also to talk about how the in-betweenness of all our different papers and subjects speaks to how much nuance there is to this. I mean, you can't just say there's one specific thing we could talk about because it's so expansive and so in-depth. And I think a lot of education now, especially if in predominantly white areas, does not cover that nuance. You get a very base flat line of information that it doesn't express the nuance of Black culture and Black life in the past or in the present. And I think we need to read this stuff. I mean, I had never heard of the book Iola Leroy before college, and now I've read it and I think it's one of the best books ever. And I would not have been given that opportunity without further education into the nuances of all of it. So.
And that question of education is obviously a really important one right now, as sort of concerns over how race and the history of slavery in particular and civil rights in particular being taught in classrooms is becoming a particular sort of cultural pressure point, where some darker forces in society are really trying to continue to and even further suppress a lot of that history. Yeah. Dr. Morrison, would love to hear your thoughts on the role of culture and literature for the artists you've talked about and sort of how they negotiate social change, or sort of how some of these authors are negotiating how some of these authors are negotiating social change in their texts or in their lifetimes. But I think we could also, kind of taking up Cece and Lindsay's comments, think about how these texts could be used to kind of continue to think about social change.
Yeah, I know I talked about in my essay with Phyllis Wheatley how she was pointing things out in a way where it's like, when people like insult you, but it sounds nice, so you're like, wait, what did they just say? It's like that sort of thing. So like, I think in a position that Phyllis Wheatley was in, well, like it was hard for her to actually try and implement social change because she's in a very like that's a dangerous situation if she were to really try to do what she really wanted to do. And just an example of that is how in her collection of poems, I know that so many different like white men had to sign off and say this is legit just to show that she could actually do something with and be talented. Like it was such a crazy idea for people back then that that was possible. And I think especially because she was a writer in such an early period of time in slavery, like that's definitely influential of how she was able to come across. I think with writers who were enslaved but maybe a little later on and when slavery was sadly more established, I think that would have been a different position. But with her, she was definitely on the spot a lot. So I think for her trying to implement social change would have been much harder.
Sort of along the same lines, Beloved is an interesting novel for many reasons, but it was published, I think, in the late 1980s, and it takes place in the 1870s. So the sort of time in which it is taking place is almost directly after the Civil War. As we know, not like racism did not end with the Civil War, but slavery was no longer permissible except in prison. So that sort of captures this time in which there's this big shift going on because we've just recently, 10 years is not that long in terms of war, like the effects of war last a very, very long time. So we've just come out of like the Civil War. We've just come out of this this economic system that relied on atrocities, and they're trying to, like, these people in the novel are not trying to go out and change things. They're trying to cope with themselves. So they're doing the best they can, and they just need to be able to live. And like, not everyone has the ability or like the emotional capacity to try to go out and affect change. I think it's interesting that she wrote it in presumably the 80s. And I think the story we talked about in class is that she had seen like reports of like mothers who killed their infants and thought that was a really, really charged situation that is not often discussed. I don't think I've heard it discussed much outside of the context of Beloved. And it's sort of interesting because like you have to kind of get into that headspace of like, how bad are things that you have to kill your own child because you think it is better for them. And it's something we see in a lot of the slave narratives, and like slavery is abominable no matter what, even the, like, it's never good. But when she was writing it in the 80s, that was kind of after like the height of the civil rights movement, but also it wasn't as though everything has been solved. So the civil rights movement ends and like mostly kind of dies down after the late 60s. But as we clearly know, there's still a lot of things going on. There's still systemic oppression. There's still everything. And it's still a very necessary conversation to have. I think that sometimes people try to get to stay away from things that are uncomfortable. Like, oh, we've been dealing with this for decades. Like, if we just do this one thing, pass this one bill, it'll be done. But it's never that simple, never as simple as like instating a law or having an amendment. So I think that she was trying to speak to sort of the feelings of the time that like this is something that we passed the Voting Rights Amendment, like, we passed that bill. So
I think for Iola Leroy, in terms of that book, even affecting social change today, I hate to repeat myself, but I really think it just gives nuance. I think that book is just about Black people and their lives and what was going on for them. And I think, I just think that's so important. You can't just only have literature about the horrors or like specific events or biographies. You need stories that show that they went home and visited Aunt Linda and Uncle Daniel, and they had a conversation about learning to read for fun because you get bored sometimes. And I think nuance is so important, and it humanizes the people of these stories and the people of the past that, I mean, we haven't met, so all we know is the things that happened to them. So having little moments like that really creates how real it was and how things like this actually happened. So I think it's important that we understand that these were real people who did normal things that we do now as well.
Yeah, these are really good points. I think it's really important as we're emphasizing that, especially if we're thinking about education and curriculum, that if we're teaching about if we're teaching a Black history unit within a much longer unit and we're only able to teach one text, what kinds of pressure does that put on Black authors, Black characters, in order to be stand-ins for incredibly complex traditions, and all of that nuance that you were talking about, Lindsay, that kinds of gets erased. But also to your point, Eliana, what kind of pressure does it put on characters to be sort of civil rights figures rather than just people trying to do their best, and people just living their lives, as you're emphasizing, Lindsay. And I think Phyllis Wheatley, to your point, Cece, is somebody who absolutely felt those pressures, right? She is not somebody who's writing in a much later period where there's an established Black literary tradition, or there are other voices of enslaved or formerly enslaved people that she could be in conversation with. That puts an immense amount of pressure on an author who is viewed to be emblematic or representative. And that ends up flattening a lot of that nuance and a lot of possibility for complexity. Dr. Morrison has a question that is probably pointedly directed at Lindsay, because it's about Iola Leroy in particular. But I'm wondering if Cece and Eliana, if there are thoughts that you have on this as well. She writes, the respected figures without formal education in Iola Leroy, reminder of Aunt Chloe. Are there other such everyday figures, everyday in quotes, who advance a certain argument for the centrality of everyday Black people's experiences and knowledge? So either sort of in the text that you're reading and that you're talking about, or potentially even elsewhere.
I'll give you time to think and talk about Iola Leroy because I know a whole lot about it. So I think, I mean, we obviously know Aunt Linda and Uncle Daniel are pretty evident characters for the type of everyday experiences and knowledge that they have. And I think that is super important to the story. I mean, I think it's been a while since I've read the book, so I apologize. But I think it really like spurs Robert and Iola into their actions. They give them advice. They talk to them about life and what they should do and how they should proceed and what they want to do after the Civil War is over. And so I think you need people who aren't scholars, who aren't amazing social activists. I think you need people who are I just work on my farm now, and you need people who are every day to humble you, to keep you grounded, and to give you advice that you might not see because you're so in a different plane than what people might consider every day.
I sort of have a point that goes along with this. It's that a lot of times, like when you read slave narratives and books about slavery and fictional books about slavery, the ones that tend to be more autobiographical tend to be the ones that the broader culture would consider exceptional. They're the people who were able to liberate themselves and learn to read and write really like eloquently and all that sort of thing. So I think the whole idea of like who gets to write down their story, it's the people who are educated, it's the people who are viewed by the society as exceptional. They're much more likely to be able to have a legacy because society is rarely interested in remembering the everyday people. I think that that's part of like the power of sort of novels, is that you can go and you can examine like this is a normal person. They're not like they aren't trying to change the world. They're not trying to write down everything that's happening to them. They're just trying to get through it. And I think it is important to read autobiographical things to understand what it was like for people. But I think that we're currently reading in Dr. Boutelle's class, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And there are several times when she just like sort of takes a step back and was like, hey, this is what it was like for me. And this is why it was like that for me. It is not like that for a lot of other people. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot of like who gets to write what is important to that question.
I also agree. I don't really have anything to add right now. I noticed that there is a question in the Q&A if you wanted to look at that.
Yeah, sure. So Kimberly Yancey in the Q&A has observed that all of your papers and presentations have so much to do with intersectionality. So thinking about the intersections of different identities and struggles inside and outside the Black community. How do you think this connects to placemaking inside the Black community and the role of allyship?
I think that so intersectionality is really important, and it's important to listen to Black people when they tell us things. And I would think that placemaking inside of the Black community is probably not something that I should speak about. I think that so there's this sort of thing, there was this event that my friend was talking to me about, is like events that are for Black people only. And I think those can be very important because a lot of times when white people are there or people of minority are there, they can, even sometimes unintentionally, do a lot of like microaggressive things. Like they'll say things and you're just like, oh, it's not good. And I think a lot of people do it unintentionally, and a lot of people don't think about it, and a lot of people don't they can't entirely get it. So I think it's important to have spaces that are like safe and places that you can sort of like not have to deal with certain things. I think it is important for people who are not a part of the community to try to learn and to try to do their best to do the work, but I don't think that I think that there are multiple spaces that should be built. I don't think there's just like one space that we all come together and that's the main space. I think there are always going to be a lot of different spaces you go for different things. Not sure if that answered it very well or not. But.
I agree with Eliana. I also believe that there is a time and a place for everything. I think that definitely like an example of where just like in the question talking about allyship and having a role in and around the Black community. I know like I often, like my boyfriend is Black, and I do sometimes feel where I know that I don't need to say anything because this is his experience. I don't need to give my opinion. And I think that just being educated and not assuming anything or speaking for someone else, I think that's a really big thing, especially like in classrooms. I know like growing up, a lot of people probably have an experience where it is a very like white dominated school, especially like in high schools. And when talking about anything to do with the minority, specifically for Black people, it's definitely uncomfortable when a white person is so eager to speak up about it and totally walk over a Black person's experience just because they want to have their 2 cents in. And just making sure that you step back and like you're actually hearing a person and not, you don't have to respond to everything. I think a lot of the times reflecting and just self-evaluation on your own is really effective rather than feeling like you always have to do something. Because I know personally, especially during COVID when the Black Lives Matter movement was on the rise, like I went to a lot of different protests and I felt like that was the least I could do. And I felt like I wanted to do more, but I realized like I can't always do more. I can't speak for anyone other than myself. So I think in terms of the like the papers and everything that we've been going over, just having so many different perspectives and as many as you can have and constantly learning about different experiences is really effective in creating a place for yourself especially and for others and learning where you stand with the Black community.
Yeah, I really agree with what you were saying. I think a big part of allyship is shutting up. And that's something that specifically white people need to do a whole lot more in terms of listening to the Black community and all other communities of color. I think white people have said a lot and maybe shouldn't say as much. And I think, again, to what you were saying, Cece, like intersectionality, you need to hear about and read about other people's experiences. We had a lot of white Disney princesses for a long time. And so white girls knew that they could be a princess, but girls of color didn't. And I think we need more Disney princesses of every single color. We need more of not white. And so people of color can see themselves, and also so white people don't think, well, I'm the best and I'm the only thing there is. And you know, I hate to use the same word over and over and over again, but nuance. You have to understand the nuance of different people. And if you don't read about other people, if you don't ever listen to other people, you're never going to learn. You're only going to know what you know, and that's not enough.
I think I just wanted to add like also I think so I am mixed race, so I have one white parent and one parent of color. And I think just like my dad, he always tries to educate himself, especially because like, you know, his daughter is not fully white. But I think just like not only educating yourself on like the Black community, but that doesn't mean you have to put all the other like communities down or vice versa. Like if you're learning about another community, that doesn't mean that that makes that one better. So I think just keeping everything like on the same plane, not trying to be like, okay, we're gonna do this now. Like this is the main like topic of discussion. So this is better than everything else. So kind of going off of what Lindsay says, like not necessarily like white people like making sure that they don't think that they're the best, but making sure that like it's not that one is better than the other. So
yeah, thank you all for sharing, you know, your personal experiences and those in response to that question. I mean, to connect some of your responses back to the papers, I mean, I'm thinking about the observation that I think you made, Eliana, that like there sort of need to be kind of multiple spaces, and there's never kind of going to be sort of like one general convening space. I think is really important, and thinking about the kinds of conversations that happen in Black spaces that need to happen in Black spaces, and then the kinds of conversations that need to happen in coalitional spaces, and then conversations that need to happen among white people and among people who are not Black. That there is is room for all of those spaces, and some of those spaces overlap and some of those spaces don't. And thinking about how this manifests in some of the literature, I'm thinking about some of the internecine conversations in Iola Leroy. I mean, these are conversations about Black placemaking and about sort of Black organizing that are happening among Black people, right? But then I'm also thinking about in Beloved, for instance. Eliana, you talked about how even sometimes well-meaning white people go into spaces where their presence disrupts that. And I think about the climax of Beloved, right? Where Mr. Bodwin, the abolitionist, shows up at 124 to pick Denver up and bring her to work. This is a well-meaning white person who is doing the work and putting his money where his mouth is, and is trying to be an ally to the Black community, but his presence at 124 ends up creating the climax of that novel, because for Setha, this white man in a hat arriving at 124 reminds her of school teacher arriving at 124, right? So that even that well-meaning intrusion into by a white person into a Black space can have unexpected and damaging consequences, right? Yeah, any other thoughts and questions for our panelists? Yeah, snaps in the chat for you all. You guys did amazing, thoroughly enjoyed each piece, good job. All right, well, I think we should, let's leave off on that note. I think we can leave off on some approbation and appreciation of our wonderful panelists. If you could get one last virtual round of applause for everyone here for sharing their work today. Thank you all so much. Thank you all in the audience for coming and for spending your time with us this afternoon. And we look forward to being in conversation more throughout the rest of the sort of wrap up here of CACE. So thank you, Cece, Eliana, and Lindsay. Thank you, Noelle, for convening us, and we will see you all soon.